What's up, everybody? I'm David Hain, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 14 of the A to D From Addict to Disciple podcast. The title of today's episode is Doing the Impossible. And today I'm adding a new feature to the A to D podcast. In the description of this episode, I've added a link that will take you to Anchor Podcast, where you can click on the message button to leave me a voice message of up to 1 minute long. After listening to today's episode, I invite all of you to leave me a message anytime and every time you find yourself doing the impossible. When we come back, on with the episode. When I was working in the streets and abandoned homes of the Kensington part of Philadelphia, I met a 22-year-old addict who went by the name of Goo. I'd like to read you some of the words that Goo wrote on the wall of an abando that I put in my book, The Heart of an Addict. Here's Goo's words. Last high, going to detox, fixing my life and my health. I leave my addiction and old self here. It does feel good to be clean. You just have to get used to it. Whoever reads this, be safe. Think about it. Remember when we were young, innocent, and happy? What happened? Well, after another failed attempt at detox and recovery, Goo was still back in that same abandoned home 6 months later and wrote on that very same wall these words. Some of us will make it. Will I be one of the few? I have tasted sobriety and it does taste great. If you pray, please pray for me. I'll be praying for those of you who enter this abandon. Hopefully, I won't be here for another entry. As you listen to those words, can you hear Goo's heart? Can you hear his desire to get out of his heroin addiction and get his life back? Can you hear his struggle with failing again and again at detox and rehab? Can you hear his battle with doubt as he tries to hold on to hope and asks, will I be one of the few to make it? Can you hear his yearning to do what's been elusive and impossible for him? Goo, like everyone who got caught up in the snare of heroin, knew the cycle of addiction and the battle to break free. Perhaps you took a similar path in the cycle of addiction, regardless of what you became addicted to. Do you remember when you passed from experimentation or your initial use to using more frequently? As you increased your using and your tolerance increased at the same time, and then before you knew it, you were physically or emotionally dependent on your drug of choice? Do you remember using just to feel normal and fit in? Is that the first time that you felt it would be impossible to get your life back? Have you ever, like Goo, tried detox and rehab several times only to relapse again and again? Every one of us in addiction can stop for a day or two, a week or two, maybe even a month or two. But when we relapse, we believe that it's impossible for us personally to maintain recovery. Have you ever been overwhelmed by the things in the long list of stuff that was impossible to do in your recovery? Here's some of the things that men and women bouncing between active addiction and recovery told me were impossible for them. It's impossible to get my family back. It's impossible to hold a job. It's impossible to tell the truth 2 sentences in a row or even remember what I told someone last time I saw them. It's impossible to stay in a relationship. It's impossible to maintain my own place to live. It's impossible to keep my promises that I've made to myself, my friends, and my loved ones. Every time I quit using, I just feel bored. It's impossible for me to enjoy everyday life. I'm not happy anymore. I have no motivation, no inspiration. I feel lost in this world of sobriety. Will I ever overcome the social stigma of having been an addict, having been in rehab, having been in prison? How do I explain the gaps in my work history when I do get an interview for a job? It's impossible for me to ever just feel normal. Even before I became an addict, I was always the loner. I was always the outcast. I was always the black sheep in the family. I was always uncomfortable being around other people. I don't think anyone could truly love me because I never meet their expectations or live up to their demands. It's just impossible. Sure. That's a long list and easily overwhelming. So how do you become someone in recovery who does the impossible rather than being overwhelmed by the impossible? How do you become someone who does the impossible every day, every week? Well, here's some quotes that will kick around to get you started. Audrey Hepburn said, "Nothing is impossible. The word itself says, I'm possible." That's right. So the first step is to put the apostrophe in there between the I and the M and put a space. So instead of the word impossible, it says, I'm possible. So change that word in your mental dictionary from impossible to I'm possible and begin to believe it. And once you begin to believe that you are possible, then it's time to heed the words of St. Francis of Assisi, who said, start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible. Do you get that? Start by doing the things that are necessary, the things that you just have to do, whether they seem possible or not. And after that, you'll find yourself doing what's possible or probable, and before you know it, you'll be doing the impossible. If you find yourself hesitating to do the things that are truly possible for you to do, remember why you started on your path of recovery in the first place, and take heart from the words of Nelson Mandela, who said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." Are you beginning to see the picture? The more we keep doing things that are necessary and possible, then we realize that we've just completed things that only a week ago, a month ago, or a year ago would have been impossible. And hopefully, all of you listening will get to the point where you agree with Walt Disney, who said, "It's kind of fun to do the impossible." I'd like to close with a quote by Frank L. Gaines, who wrote, "Only he who can see the invisible can do the impossible." Do you remember the Man in the Mirror episode of the A to D podcast? Have you become that person who sees the possible when you look in the mirror at yourself? I encourage you to go back to that mirror, the one with your post-it notes of encouragement stuck fast to them, and sing the lyrics of the Bill Withers song "Lovely Day" to yourself when you look in the mirror. Here's the lyrics. When I wake up in the morning and the sunlight hurts my eyes, and something without warning bears heavy on my mind, when the day that lies ahead of me seems impossible to face, when someone else instead of me always seems to know the way, then I look at you, and the world's all right with me. Just one look at you, and I know it's going to be a lovely day. Thanks for listening to this episode of the A to D From Addict to Disciple podcast. In recovery, we all become people who are doing the impossible every day, every week, everywhere. What things have you done this week that would have been impossible last year? Remember to click on the link in the description of this podcast and go to my Anchor podcast page, scroll down a little, click on the message button, and send me a voice message of one thing you did that was previously impossible for you. I'll post at least one of these at the beginning or the end of each podcast, so feel free to message me often. Let's become a community of listeners who encourage each other every week by sharing our impossible made possible. Please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Share the podcast link with 2 or 3 people this week. Keep sending your feedback, and if you would like to be part of a weekly Zoom meeting on addiction and recovery, contact me by email at davidfromA2D@gmail.com or by Instagram at davidfromA2D. Tune in every Monday for a new episode of the A to D From Addict to Disciple podcast.